This is Twit.
We talked a little bit about Charter. Now, they're ranked as the second largest cable operator after Comcast. They report over 27 million residential and business customers from coast to coast. But its problems began in New York when it acquired Time Warner Cable back in 2015 for $57 billion. Now, Charter Communications purchased Time Warner Cable, but they potentially are this is one of the most disruptive purchases in the history of telecom under fire. Now, it's under fire because in the past several weeks, the New York State Public Service Commission voted to revoke its approval of the sale. Now, the reason for the revoke, they have a laundry list of stuff here. I'll try to go through some of them. Now, the company's repeated failures to meet deadlines, Charter's attempts to skirt obligations to serve rural communities, unsafe practices in the field, its failure to fully commit to its obligations under the 2016 merger agreement, and the company's purposeful obfuscation of its performance and compliance obligations to the commission and its customers. Now, and Charter insists that it actually hit its deadlines and it remains in compliance. But if the threat of making Spectrum forfeit its cable franchise wasn't enough, Charter Spectrum is also facing secondary serious allegations by the state attorney general themselves. Now, Chibert, is this going to be enough to move such a large company and actually send a message so that they can start doing the right thing here? Because a lot of these deals, they just say, oh, yeah, we'll do that. As long as you approve this thing, we'll do it. And then they go and do it, and then nothing happens thereafter. So this is the way New York State is handling it. They're saying, you know what? You're violating all these things, so we just don't approve it anymore. You can go do your thing, but you're not going to be able to be the same entity. And the only way to do it is to start doing these things. Is this a way to send a message? Does every state have to do this?
I don't know. I hope not. But the bottom line is New York State Attorney General. Well, they're oh God, what do they call them? In Hawaii we call it the Public Utilities Commission, but they got to do something. And sadly, it looks like they're using this case as an example. And I gotta imagine, all the things I've been reading, lots and lots and lots of states are looking at what New York is doing and saying, maybe this will work. So there's a lot of wait and see. The fact that these companies are not fulfilling the terms of their contract, if you were a smaller company, you didn't, comply to the terms of your contract in New York State, you'd get shut down in a heartbeat. But if you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation, you get slapped on the wrist. I think it's time to level the playing field, and to the folks in New York State, good luck.
I agree. I think this gives it the option to, at least it gives more options to consumers, because you're kind of pushing the enterprise, these large telecoms, to do the right thing, especially if they're violating some of the rules that they agreed to do. Bam, I want to throw this over to you, because I think, you deal with a lot of networking, a lot of companies, a lot of telecoms out there. Good quality networking is hard to find. So especially in rural areas, Charter promised to do it, right? They promised to make this better. And then as long as they promised to do that, they could get their merger approved. Do you think that this is fair, that they're being, targeted and being held accountable?
I'm not one to be in favor of a lot of regulation, but I got to say that the cable companies in particular have been playing with house money for a long time. I dealt with this in my past life, running IT for various small, medium-sized companies, and often to get good service, I'd have to go and get waivers and have one cable company come in and get waivers to pull cable in a few hundred yards across some imaginary boundary where they didn't have rights to come in. And it's a real nightmare for somebody that's on the enterprise side. For somebody that's a regular consumer, they have no options, right? They have whatever's there. They're not getting any waivers signed. They're not doing anything like that. So there's really this true monopoly system. Verizon Fios, because they're not technically a cable company, is kind of come in and disrupted that, and other fiber to the home services, Google's service have kind of come in and provided like real broadband competition. But where I live, I don't have a choice, right? So in my home, I have I'm using Comcast cable because the only other option aside from satellite-based internet access is DSL, which maxes out at 1 meg download speeds, which clearly are not going to keep up with the demands of my type of work, and also everything that me and my wife and my children all stream all the time and download and so on and so on. So, right now I'm paying the only game in town. And when things like this, and this is really not too distant from a really hot button topic like net neutrality, we start to look at, we really do have to hold these companies to their commitments so that they deliver things. And it goes back to even the previous bite, right? We talked about, electronic voter IDs, and now we're talking about, hey, there's people in rural areas that are not getting the internet access they should. So this is, proof point one that good, solid internet access is something that's become a fundamental, I won't say right, but having the option for it should be something that is provided for, just like, other utilities.
Right. I kind of glad you brought that up, because I think net neutrality is a good example of this, because a lot of people have more than one option in their area. They pay for premium service, they pay for the 100 megabit, they pay for the gigabyte services, but they don't get the quality service. They don't get consistent speeds, things drop down, and when they call in, these companies say, hey, well, these are just meant for things to load faster. It's not that we meant for large downloads of data. We just want things to go a little faster for you. And I think that's just kind of the consensus of what's going on with net neutrality is, hey, not only will you pay for premium service, but you maybe even later on pay for, faster lanes to Netflix, or faster lanes to this, or faster lanes to that. And it's just ways for telecoms to create harder problems for consumers and more expensive problems. And so only the people who have the money who can do it will get the premium, and sometimes not even guaranteed to get the premium. So, Cheapert, I want to throw this over to you, because do you think that keeping these two companies separate, it forces them to be competitors, and it forces them for a little bit more competition in the market, which is sometimes better for consumers? And then this way, maybe one company in the market, or maybe the smaller telecoms, can start doing the right thing and not being charged customers for these things, and then at least the bigger telecoms will get the message. Is this just more of a net neutrality thing? Is it a competitive thing? Where do you think is the benefit of keeping them separate?
I think one of the things that's going to happen, or starting to happen, that's going to be really, really interesting is the FTC seems to be starting to feel their oats. And, some of the blips and bites that we've done in the last half a year or so, if you read between the lines, it almost feels like the FTC is going to start implementing something along the lines of GDPR. Now, the reason why I bring this up is there's a interesting trend that's starting to happen. I'm actually knee deep in one of them, well, hip deep, with the advent of 5G. I was talking to some of the folks in the chat room about that. 5G right out of the gate is going to be more for distribution than it is to the endpoints. But having the 5G to go out and get things out into the world is going to be really interesting, especially for the wireless internet service provider, a WISP. I'm actually in the process of working with some friends here in Honolulu on designing the back-end network for a WISP. And with the new millimeter, especially the 60 gigahertz stuff, we have the bandwidth so that I, in theory, can provide gigabit symmetrical to the home for the cost that you could get, say, a Charter cable modem. So I'm hoping what happens is that the states feel that maybe there is another way. They don't have to go through the morass of pole attaches, or at least less pole attach issues, and then maybe, just maybe, the equivalent of the public utilities commissions in different states are going to say, hey, you guys aren't playing to the tune of this contract. You don't have a monopoly anymore. We're going to open it up, and you guys must provide them, the horizontal. So that's going to be really interesting. And I got to imagine this coming year, the blips and the bites are going to have an awful lot on this topic.
I agree as well. Now, I've had business internet for a while because there's SLA on the service uptime, there's quality of service requirements. Now I pay more for less speeds, but I don't have any TV or I don't have any phone service. I just have this really high quality business service. And the reason why I do that is because I go in and start paying for services like YouTube TV or DirecTV Now. And I think, Brian, you actually brought this up a little bit, is, especially with this type of merger and with the net neutrality rules going down the toilet, it makes it easier for companies like this, right, to start regulating and blocking services like this. So now it makes it hard for cord cutters, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're a cord cutter family, and we've just found that after a while, all we do is stream stuff anyway. So why continue to pay for television service from the cable company? And so we went through the process, but I just imagine a day when my cable provider says, "Hey, we don't want you getting local channels from DirecTV Now. Why not? We can just squash, make that stream perform poorly. It's very easy for them to identify which byte stream it is, so they can squash that without damaging the rest of the service they provide me over the internet, and force me back to them for local TV service, which seems very sort of anti-free market, if you ask me. And the free market economy and capitalism, isn't that what part of our values as Americans?
Right. Well, I agree with Schubert. I think this topic is not going to go away, and I'm sure we're going to hear more and more about it as the years go on, even as legislation changes for it.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. This Week in Enterprise Tech 303. New York orders Charter to sell Time Warner, withdraws their approval of the deal. Woohoo! I'm Dave Duncan, joined by Nate Darnell.
Hey.
Any feelings about someone finally? I don't know. I mean, to me, it's been like years and years and years of, whenever there's a merger request, there's like, do this and this and this and this, and we'll approve it. It's like, oh yeah, we'll totally do that. And then they don't do that, and nothing happens. So I don't know, man. I'm kind of jazzed about there finally apparently being some consequences for breaking your word. Like they said, if you were a small player, you'd be gone.
Right. Well, I think if I'm hearing this story correctly, that the merger was declined. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was approved.
It was approved. Okay.
And then it was
after they read the fine
delivery.
print.
There was no delivery on all the promises as usual.
Right.
And they said, no, that's not going to play. We withdraw our approval of this. You want to do that? That's fine. But you're doing it as two companies, not one.
Yeah, I think what's happening is that the corporate shenanigans have gone on for so long, and for so long, so many consumers and citizens believed blindly that regulatory agencies were actually doing good work, kind of like Western healthcare. And then eventually you could no longer justify the numbers. Like, how do you logically account for the fact that Western medicine spends more than anyone else and produces such miserable results? You can't unless you account for politics and bureaucracy. Once you account for politics, bureaucracy, and all of those things, now you begin to understand. And I think what's happening is that now people are just done, especially Gen Xers.
Yeah.
And they've been quiet for a long time, just handling life. And now they're just done. Now they're like, you know what? Yeah. We're done being quiet. And now it's time to stand up.
All the bankruptcies, the bubble and all that, and no one going to jail, we're done.
I've reached my tipping point, and if you don't start doing your job, we are going to vote you out. We are going to riot in the streets, and we are going to take this country back. So either do your job.
Or at the very least, we're going to spit in your coffee.
Or either do your job, or we will do your job for you. And if we do it for you, you will not like it.
Yeah, you will not be involved anymore. Yeah. Well, this is decisions made by human beings, and they have friends and family, and yelling at them for why is there no still. I mean, good grief, it's 2018. and there's still no dang internet in the rural areas. What is going on? Every third world country's got, faster internet than our rural areas.
But there is a counter argument that I have from a health and wellness standpoint.
Less Wi-Fi, less problems.
That's right. And so although, I'm listening to this other group talk about the importance of or how excited they are about implementing 5G in Hawaii.
Yeah.
The reality is that, wireless technology has a direct impact on human physiology. Now, one can argue whether or not it's more carcinogenic than cigarettes, but one can no longer argue that it causes radical reductions in antioxidant capacity in the human body. That is clear and calculated at this point. We know that. And
if it does or doesn't?
That it does. And if you cause a radical reduction in antioxidant capacity in the human body, you now make yourself much more vulnerable to a wide variety of illnesses. Now, my argument from the get-go is simply that they should have trenched and run fiber 3 decades ago.
Yeah.
They didn't because it was cheaper and more and less transparent to run everything wirelessly. And if you run everything wirelessly and you develop that, now it makes it much easier to obtain information.
I like the pronunciation there. It's like information, like they used to say in that old BBC series, The Prisoner.
That's right. It makes
information.
It makes it much easier to surveil citizens when it's done wirelessly because it's without their knowledge.
Bad guys, everyone.
Yes.
I mean, it's just about surveilling. Right?
You can always cut the fiber line.
Yeah, backhoes specialize in this.
Yes. But that being said, it's a lot healthier. And so, I mean, it's kind of a catch-22. I'm for appropriate regulation. I want to be careful that we don't overregulate and then reduce our competitiveness on the global stage.
Yeah.
But I'm also for privacy, which is, look, what I do in my home is in my home.
Yeah, I in particular am for expensive violation of privacy, right? So okay, the government has a vested interest in violating the privacy of criminals, terrorists, psychotic madmen, but not everyone. And there should be some. I think we all have cause to be somewhat secure in our house and property and not expect the man to come kick the door in. Which is something we'll cover a little bit later as they were doing it to DEF CON. The man was indeed kicking in the door, literally. But with regard to regulation, of course, it all comes back to the network neutrality stuff. And so that was a good segue to go into a clip about trying to, now that they've undone network neutrality, now they're trying to undo the precursor to network neutrality, which was that the FCC even had any right to consider those regulations to kind of head off any ability for the next administration to just like say, okay, now it's back on. So without further ado, here's a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv, the what I call the lawyer show, This Week in Law 430, the future of the FCC's past.
This is Twit.
A couple of new developments on the net neutrality front, since we're discussing legislation and policy. One is at the state level in California. You'll recall we've discussed on the show before that California was looking to enact its own net neutrality bill, which would replace the open internet rules that the FCC recently dismantled and that went out of effect. California proposed a bill. There's been some jockeying about it. There was an episode where the very sweeping bill that California was pushing through the legislature had been gutted in committee. That is being slowly restored. The strength of the bill is being restored. The EFF has a nice piece about how activism is affecting this. And we have a California senator, again, we've been discussing how people's midterm races are impacted or may be impacted by the steps that they're taking. Senator Kevin De Leon in California has been instrumental in trying to make sure that the state does enact a strong net neutrality bill. As the EFF describes, the EFF says there's been an outcry from Team Internet in California, making clear how important effective, strong net neutrality protections are. Senator De Leon and others are working to make sure that the bill that California eventually passes is actually one that will have teeth. So SB 822 is the bill that needs to be passed by the California legislature and signed by the governor. So that keeps moving forward. And the reason why Senator De Leon is interesting to me at any rate is because he is challenging this is U.S. Senator Feinstein in her race in November in California in the fall. Most polls seem to show Feinstein ahead of him, but young people, I think, are pretty compelled by the net neutrality arguments and maybe coming out and voting for the guy who's very pro strong net neutrality rules will wind up having an impact in November. Any thoughts about this, Saurabh?
So I will confess, net neutrality and telecom policy is not my main area of expertise, but one thing that jumped out at me in this debate is that this is being done at the state level, and the extent to which this could conflict with, just by its very nature, conflict with federal regulation, which is extensive, right? The FCC net neutrality rules and the debate that's been going on at the national level. If this is actually going to be done at the state level, it would seem to create the very sort of fragmentation that, for example, we've seen in response to the European Union's general data protection regulation. So in response to that, countries have been saying, okay, well, we want to carve up our rules to protect local interests, local in the sort of national rather than international sense. And if this is done at the California state level by the state legislature, I'm unsure to what extent it's going to throw a wrench in the larger policy of uniformity that I would imagine we want in U.S. telecommunications. So I'm sort of unsure which way that'll play out, but obviously California, more than most states, has its arms around these issues and has a lot of very smart people who can debate these at a high level. So I'm curious to see where it goes.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out that there will be controversy about states enacting their own net neutrality rules and how well they'll be able to stand up in the face of arguments that the area is the exclusive province of the FCC. Speaking of the FCC and what it can and cannot do, the other net neutrality development that you might want to take note of is the Trump administration has gone to the Supreme Court asking it to review and undo the DC Circuit's 2016 decision that gave the FCC the authority to enact the open internet rules that just recently got undone. So I mean, that's a pretty convoluted thing that's hard to wrap your head around. But what the Trump administration wants the Supreme Court to do, and the Supreme Court hasn't said whether it will touch this or not yet, is to go in and say, no, not only are the open internet rules gone, which they are, but they never should have been enacted in the first place because the FCC simply doesn't have the authority to do what it did. That the decision that said it had that authority was wrongly decided, and Supreme Court, you should come in and say that so it's clear. So it remains to be seen whether the Supreme Court will do that for the time being, and unless and until the Supreme Court does that, there is a federal court of appeals decision from the DC Circuit that grants the FCC or confirms in that court's opinion that the FCC has the authority to do what it did. So that will be an interesting one to watch and see if the Supreme Court decides to get involved. Any thoughts there, Saurabh?
Yeah, so I think it's important in that case to sort of what kept me oriented as I was parsing the procedural history of this is that the power that the FCC wants is to classify broadband. Yes. Right? If the FCC gets to decide what is and is not under this definition, Title I versus Title II of the act that gives it its power, the power to classify and sort of say this set of legal definitions and all the power that comes with it is where we are focusing our attention versus this other legal category. The power to make that determination, if the agency has that, then it's really setting the terms of the debate. And this will ultimately be decided by who the current administration is and sort of what political appointments they have made in terms of commissioners to the FCC. So it's a very politically accountable, politically sensitive process, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. If the argument is that the FCC doesn't have the authority to engage in that kind of classification, then the agency's hands are tied, and the scope of its ability to make politically charged decisions is going to be much more limited. And that's something that, if that's what you want, the court is certainly the authority to ask. So as we were talking about before in the patent system, this too seems fundamentally to me to be a fight about not what the right answer is, but who gets to decide. And
right.
Those are precisely the sorts of questions I think the Supreme Court is best suited for. So whether they take it or not, I don't know. But if anybody should be answering it, it's probably the Supreme Court. And if they decline cert, then I think that at least implicitly be ratifying what the D.C. Circuit had done.
Yes, I agree, and I think it'll be interesting to if we spin this out further and hypothesize that the Supreme Court takes it and decides to undo what the D.C. Circuit did and says yes, the FCC does not have that authority, then that really punts it back to Congress and once again makes it all the more political. Congress has so far not done what California is trying to do, enacted its own net neutrality framework, and maybe it would have to decide, based on the interests and wishes of its constituents, whether it's going to go there. And the Supreme Court could put that ball squarely in Congress's court if it takes this case and decides that way. So again, something to watch, and the procedures about net neutrality rules continue to be very interesting to follow and hard to predict. So just updating people that those developments happened.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was This Week in Law 430, Future of FCC Past. So, yeah, all right, let's... Okay, got rid of net neutrality. Now let's go back and undercut that it should have... let's unroll the past that it ever existed at all. Yeah.
All right. So what's the option for fairness for everyone?
Well, the option for fairness for everyone, I suppose, was network neutrality. But short of that, the kind of meta issues around this is that companies need some sort of predictability in the marketplace, so they need the rules to stop jumping around. The FCC decision to unroll net neutrality was arguably illegal because you're supposed to have a reason to make changes, and they didn't really forward that anything had changed since the rule was passed. They just, decided they didn't want it there. It was just it was a personal choice to remove it, and that's not legal. So, that would be subject to being easily reversed. So if you go back and say, well, it was never their call in the first place, then you cut that off. There's also all these efforts by states to do their own versions of network neutrality using the power of the checkbook, saying, if you want the government of California or whatever to do business with you, then you're going to adhere to network neutrality. And the states do have a lot of ability to, allow other players to come in if, they don't want to play ball. Like we were talking about before with the rural coverage that the carriers don't like to do because it's expensive and it's not as profitable as in the city. So they want all the low hanging fruit, and they don't want to pay for any of the garden maintenance. They just, they don't want to. And, even though they promise to, as long as there's no penalty, then they're just not gonna, because, they're making money. So, but all the states doing their own thing, that's more fragmentation and more uncertainty, because the net is kind of an international medium. So if you have different rules everywhere, it's like, okay, well, now you start getting into cases of where, we're trying to make rules for what goes on in Britain, or Mississippi's trying to make rules for what goes on in California. Sad. All right. Well, so we were talking a little bit about, kicking in doors earlier. Nobody wants, to have their doors kicked in. Well, that was put to the test this last weekend for DEF CON, where because of the Las Vegas shooting of that one courtyard, there was a music event and the guy was, holed up in the room with lots and lots of rifles and stuff. So apparently some of the hotels kind of overreacted and there was a mess. So anyway, for kind of the breakdown on this, then we can discuss it. Here is Twit.tv's This Week in Enterprise Tech 304, talking about the kind of room service you get at DEF CON.
This is Twit.
Now, we actually heard a little bit about the hotels in Vegas and Las Vegas, how they weren't taking any chances when it comes down to big security and that hacker conference that was there in town there, especially Caesars Palace. Now, I wasn't there, but I did see a bunch of streams of tweets coming from attendees complaining about random searches and sometimes seizures from their rooms in the hotel. Now, in fact, I saw several tweets about individuals being quoted banned from ever returning to Black Hat at Caesars Palace because they didn't cooperate or comply with the security individuals. Now, there were always two sides to this story, but it sometimes sounds like they were actually using bullying techniques to ensure attendees and residents stayed in line during the conferences. To me, it could either go either way when it comes to bullying. Now, I want to throw this over to Curtis because, I wasn't there. Did you see this while you were there?
Well, it's interesting because I heard a lot of people talking about it. I did not stay at Caesars because I had been at Black Hat earlier in the week. I was staying at Mandalay Bay. I continued to stay at Mandalay Bay through the weekend, mainly because I was too lazy to pack up all my stuff and move. I did find it fascinating, though, that Mandalay Bay is the hotel where the tragedy, the shooting occurred only a few months ago. So you would expect that they would be the highest security venue on the Strip. If they are the highest security venue on the Strip, then they do it in a much more subtle fashion than they were doing it at Caesars Palace. I do think that at least someone at Caesars panicked. They decided that all of these hackers coming in must be up to no good, and they just panicked. I think it's going to end up costing them a fair amount of money because Dark Tangent, the person who organizes DEF CON, has already announced that the conference next year will not be at Caesars. This was out of hand. Now, hotels everywhere have announced policies basically saying that if you have a do not disturb sign on your door for too long, they reserve the right to go into the room and look around. After what happened in Las Vegas, that is an entirely reasonable and understandable response. But what was going on at Caesars was not that. Like I said, at the very least, someone on the Caesars staff lost their mind and decided that the only response was one that was way over the top, super intrusive, and in some cases bordering on abuse especially of female and non-binary gendered guests.
Right. I don't know about you, but I just wouldn't even keep anything in my room as it is, let alone put the do not disturb on there. But that's just me. Now, Heather, you were there as well. Did you see any of this? Did you hear any of this? Do you experience it yourself?
And I did hear quite a bit about it, just as Curtis did. Certainly, my Twitter feed blew up about it. And like Curtis, I opted to stay at the Mandalay Bay. Although I did hear that Mandalay Bay, that there were DEF CON attendees at those locations. So it wasn't just at Caesars that some of this was going on. And certainly the walking into a room without knocking, and especially if you're a female traveling alone, is pretty disconcerting. I agree with Curtis that I think at the very least somebody at Caesars failed to consider their audience. Bullying techniques might work with some people, but if you've got a poorly identified security officer with an iron-on patch on his shirt and a something that looks like a plastic ID that without a name on it or anything, that's going to ring some bells that you're not going to get immediate cooperation from this type of audience. And they pushed back, and I think rightly so.
Right. Yeah, actually, I was reading that there was some people that were saying, hey, people are actually exploiting this. Obviously, we're at a hacker conference. People are going to exploit processes and protocols. And they were, like you were saying, they were having people dress up like security individuals. They didn't have any badge or anything. And they were pretending like they were trying to do a search of people's rooms or knocking on people's doors. And so people were freaking out. They were calling security and freaking out. I don't know, Cheever, what do you think? Was this just a knee-jerk reaction, or do you think this was, should they have done this?
No, this is bad policy. No matter how you look at it, it's really bad policy. Let's put it this way. I am ex-law enforcement, and there's a very, very good reason why law enforcement organizations spend so freaking much money on badges and why it's so hard to get a replacement badge. The idea is you need credentials that are hard to duplicate. You need credentials that inspire confidence. And when you start hiring a lot of temporary people, for God's sakes, cost of security isn't horrible. You're hiring people because you want to protect your property, you want to protect your guests. Someone forgot this. And even if you're hiring temps, you need to do some vetting. So I'm sorry, Caesars. You guys have forgotten that you are calling these people that are staying on your property guests. You need to treat them like guests. Treat them with some respect. Treat them, especially their non-binary gender guests. Come on. They're sensitive enough as it is. Be nice about it. Law enforcement has had this kind of situation happening to them an awful lot over the hundreds of years that we've had, organized law enforcement. And they've learned a lot of lessons. Now, your security forces a lot of the heads tend to be retired or injured law enforcement that have been forced into retirement. Come on, you guys have the experience. Use it. Train your people. Spend a little bit of time. Sensitivity training is mandatory at almost every law enforcement organization I've ever worked with. And Caesars, time for retraining.
Right. I think so too. I think there's a lot of professionals. Obviously, there's going to be people who pay to go that they're not professionals. They're college students. They're just people from the industry, or just not even people that are from the industry. They're just people who are into tech and into hacking, and they decided to go. So you're going to have different levels of tiers of individuals there, but you are going to have professional people. In fact, some of the tweets came from people who are security experts at Google and other companies. They were saying they felt kind of bullied and monopolized on that front. So I think that this is definitely something that these companies, these organizations, they need to think about, because I think when people feel bullied, they don't want to go back. They don't want to be part of that. And that's even beyond the conference. It's going to be, that's going to be beyond the conference itself. Now, Curtis, I want to throw this over to you. I mean, when you have a hotel room, you travel a lot. Do you feel that you have of expectancy of a level of privacy when you have a room like that?
Oh, absolutely. And courts have said that that expectation of privacy is not misplaced. Now, you don't have absolute privacy within the confines of your hotel room, but neither do you give up all of your Fourth Amendment rights. So it is a balancing act, and what we saw here was someone who forgot the balance. And now this is something that I'm sensitive about, because on my very first business trip back long ago, I was robbed in my hotel room. I woke up one night to suddenly notice that a light was on. I rolled over in bed, and there was someone sitting on my couch going through my pants to get cash and such. Fortunately, they did exactly the right thing at that moment. They got up and left. But believe me, that experience sensitized me to these issues. I know what it's like to feel terrified in your hotel room. I know what it's like to feel that you don't have basic security. And both of those things are wrapped up in the very word hospitality. When an organization like Caesars gets the balance wrong, they forget which industry they're in. Now, yes, it's important that all of the guests at a property feel safe and secure, but that means all the guests, not just the ones who don't happen to be going to a particular con. This was unreasonable, and I think that Caesars deserves every bit of the approbation and community shame that's coming down upon them. Perhaps this will be an educational moment for them, and it won't happen again to another group.
Right. Now, Heather, what do you think? Is this making them a target now? I mean, that people feel a sense of community when it comes to these conferences. They're, like Curtis said, they're sensitive. So, could this create them as a target now going forward, even in future Black Hats and DEF CONs when they even don't even have the conference there? Could this make them a target and make them vulnerable?
Well, I think anytime a group of InfoSec people invade a space, they get attention. But actually, I'd like to take it back. I don't think that this is about security, such as it is. It's about the way it was implemented. There's nothing related to security that says that it's okay for a hotel employee to walk into a room unannounced without knocking or just badging themselves in. That's not about to a place that there was nothing reported. There was no wellness check that they were trying to do. Going in and searching rooms and taking pictures of the rooms and making jokes about sharing them on their personal Snapchat, that has nothing to do with security. That has everything to do with just a violation of privacy. I have nothing wrong with increased security and taking the appropriate steps. And actually at the Mandalay Bay, I did see there was some increased security. It was a little bit more laid back, but there were canine units that were going through the convention center periodically. There was an armed guard in the elevator bay. I'm pretty sure 24/7, and that's okay and that's appropriate. It seemed like they were particularly targeting DEF CON attendees, and Caesars just sort of got a little bit out of hand with the way they went about it.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from This Week in Enterprise Tech 304 at Twit TV. DEF CON room service. So, yeah, a lot to unpack there. I kind of wonder what, my first reaction is, I wonder what it is they expect to catch with this.
I don't think anyone should have their door kicked in.
Yeah.
And I realize that there's some heightened awareness around an unfortunate thing that happened several months ago, which still really weirdly was taken out of the public spotlight with no real clear understanding of.
Yeah, there was no there was no real reason for this guy, and I think at the time we kind of theorized like, hey, one of the things that happens when you got a lot of money is you get disconnected from any sort of feedback that you're going off the rails.
But more disturbingly, there was no continued public discourse about the largest gun massacre in American history, or in recent history.
Well, he didn't have a turban, and he wasn't a minority, so and he wasn't poor.
Well, I mean, I suppose that
rich white man kills crowd. It's like that doesn't play very well. So they like, let's get rid of that.
I suppose that's one argument to be made, but I'm still thinking that there are other forces at play, and that's why I immediately went to another line of argument about this, which is, okay, this is in very close proximity. What else is happening here? But if nothing else, I think this gave greater urgency to the Black Hatters to develop better tools.
Yeah. I expect they're going to be developing a lot of tools for how to secure their doors.
Right.
Or like things that page you if someone's messing with your door and things like that.
So I mean,
there's a lot to unpack here. So
do the White Hatters have their doors kicked in, or just the Black Hatters?
This was not okay. So this is a very important point. So I was looking up some stuff about what kind of rights do you have in a hotel room? What kind of rights to privacy? And yes, the hotel management does have the right to enter and search your room without your permission, if they have reason to believe that you're engaged in illegal acts. And so what's happened here is they've extended simply not wanting to have the maids looting through your valuable electronics as reason to think you're engaged in illegal acts. Huh. That's the stretch here that they made that I think was completely inappropriate. That was one part. And the other one was, if you're going to do something exceptionally controversial and delicate, like, go charging into rooms while the people are dressing and stuff, you need to have some freaking procedures in place. Ill-trained guys with no real, doing something that's very unusual, just like, people didn't grow up in, Soviet Russia, that you don't expect for someone to just go barging into your room, without
Stalin
any reason.
Style.
You're not doing anything, and all of a sudden people demanding to be let in your room or banging on your door and screaming at you to open up the door. It's like you don't expect that. So I think there's more reason to believe it's a criminal.
Well, I think you grew up in a nice part of town.
Hey. Keep Salem weird? No, nobody? Crickets? Yeah, so I think what's really sad here is that this would even occur to someone to be a good idea. It really says to me that a lot of people have figured that human dignity is completely other people's human dignity is completely optional. That you have any position of advantage that you can, violate people's dignity with there being no repercussions. That was the assumption. It's like, yeah, we own the hotel, we can do whatever we want. That's not true. The people do still have protection under the law, and there's going to be some lawsuits out of this. And boy, the group not to annoy was the DEF CON crowd, because they're all like security experts on one side of the fence or the other. So it'll be interesting to see interesting events happen for the hotel going down the line. They may have really kicked the hornet's nest on this one. All right. Well, one last clip here right before we go out. There was a bit of a hubbub about Google location being on even if you told it to be off. So here's a little more detail on that from twit.tv. This is Security Now 676.
This is Twit.
The Hacker News reported on some research that the AP, the Associated Press, did, which it's probably, this is maybe a little inflammatory clickbait, but it's worth pointing out to our listeners. The statement was, Google tracks you everywhere, even if you explicitly tell it not to. And there is some truth to it. What the AP found is that preventing Google from acquiring long-term tracking data requires more than turning off the obvious location history function. What the Hacker News wrote was, every time a service like Google Maps wants to use your location, Google asks your permission to allow access to your location if you want to use it for navigating. They say, but a new investigation shows that the company does track you anyway. The AP revealed that many Google services on Android and iPhone devices store records of your location data even when you have paused the location history on your mobile device. Disabling location history in the privacy settings of Google applications should prevent, it is argued, Google from keeping track of your every movement, as its own support page states, quote, you can turn off location history at any time. With location history off, the places you go are no longer stored. That's not true. As the AP explains, quote, from the AP, for example, Google stores a snapshot of where you are when you merely open its Maps app. Automatic daily weather updates on Android phones pinpoint roughly where you are, and some searches that have nothing to do with location, like chocolate chip cookies and kids' science kits, pinpoint your precise latitude and longitude, they write, accurate to the square foot, and save it to your Google account. During their coverage, to demonstrate the threat of this, what they consider, I mean, again, clickbait, but worth understanding, of this Google practice, the AP created a visual map of the movements of a Princeton postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Akar, who carried an Android smartphone with location history switched off to prevent location data collection. However, the researchers discovered that the map includes records of Dr. Akar's train commute on 2 trips to New York and visits to Highline Park, Chelsea Market, Hell's Kitchen, Central Park, and Harlem. To protect the privacy of Dr. Akar, the publication did not plot the most telling and frequent marker on the map, his home address. According to the researchers, this privacy issue affects around 2 billion Android users and hundreds of millions of iPhone users across the world who rely on Google Maps or search. In response to the AP's investigation, Google issued the following statement, quote, there are a number of different ways that Google may use location to improve people's experience, including location history, web and app activity, and through device-level location services. They say we provide clear descriptions of these tools and robust controls so people can turn them on or off and delete their histories at any time. Jonathan Mayer, whom we've spoken of years past, often, a Princeton researcher and former chief technologist for the FCC's Enforcement Bureau, argued, if you're going to allow users to turn off something called location history, then all the places where you maintain location history should be turned off. He says that seems like a pretty straightforward position to have. So, for what it's worth, to stop Google from saving time-stamped location markers, users need to turn off another setting, and that's that web and app activity, which is enabled by default and stores a variety of information from Google apps and sites to your Google account. Once disabled, it will not only stop Google from storing location markers, but also prevents the company from storing information generated by searches and other activities. So anyway, if I just wanted to point this out, it seemed a little over the top in the way it was being described, but it's certainly reasonable if somebody wasn't really paying attention and thought that just turning off location history shut that down completely. You also need to go into your Google account and turn off web and app activity, which does not just record activity, but where that activity occurred.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from twit.tv, Security Now 676, how to actually turn off Google location. And, and as we've said before, there's a whole lot more information leaking than that. So with that, we'll wrap it up and say you've done it again. You spent another hour talking about technology with Dave and Nate. Hope you'll continue this conversation next week and every week, noon to 1 o'clock on Wednesdays for Northwest Tech Show.